Now this, of course, raises all kinds of questions. And one of the questions would be, if the Bible is inspired, then how can I believe that the authors of the Bible use sources from things that were not necessarily inspired? But we do know that the biblical writers used sources, okay? With virtual certainty we know they did, and one reason is because they tell us they did, okay? And when someone first introduced to me the idea that there were sources that weren't inspired and that weren't authoritative that the Bible writers used, then I go, well, then how can the Bible be inspired? Okay? But clearly the existence of sources doesn't preclude the operation of the Holy Spirit in the writing of the sacred text. Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. We have this lesson, and one more lesson on the subject of the Bible, and we have talked about how the Bible is written, how the Bible is inspired. We've talked about the idea of canon. We've talked about why other religious texts, we don't include those in the canon. And then last week we talked about the idea of the text and how can we have confidence that the text that we possess in our Bibles accurately represents what was originally written. So how were the texts copied? How were they circulated? How were they preserved? And that sort of question. And that leads us then into the subject that we're going to talk about today, about what's called biblical criticism. And I have several sources for you here. I think I've mentioned all these before, except particularly I want to point out Quarles' essay in the book, In the Defense of the Bible. His essay on higher criticism is very helpful and very informative. But these other sources, I think I've mentioned those before. So we'll just go on. So this term biblical criticism gets thrown around a lot. So what are we actually talking about? And biblical criticism actually is a branch of study within the broader category of what's called literary criticism. So you have this scholarly or academic branch of study called literary criticism. That's the study of various literatures, both ancient and modern and that sort of thing. And within that, then you have this category where the focus is on the literature of the Bible. So it's called biblical criticism. And the New World Encyclopedia defines it as a form of literary criticism that seeks to analyze the Bible through asking certain questions about the text, such as who wrote it, when was it written, what was the historical and cultural setting of the text, how well preserved is the original text, how was the text transmitted over time, what is the text's literary genre, how did it come to be accepted as part of the Bible, and questions like that. So in this context, what we have to keep in mind is that the term criticism is referring to this kind of systematic, reasoned approach to the study of the biblical text, all right? And so it doesn't in any way necessarily imply, oftentimes we think of the word criticism associated with the word critic or criticize, but the term, when you're using it in reference to biblical criticism, doesn't necessarily imply anything of critical or a criticizing or a negative nature. Quarles, in that essay that I just mentioned, says, although some practitioners of critical methods may offer very negative critiques of the Bible, such criticism is not intrinsic to critical approaches. Those who practice the historical critical method do not necessarily criticize the Bible in a negative sense. So the first thing we kind of have to disabuse ourselves of when we start talking about biblical criticism and using the term is we need to disabuse ourselves of this kind of very negative view that sometimes is associated with it. So given then what the things we've just said about biblical criticism, one of the things you'll notice is that what biblical criticism really is focused on is it's focused on that human aspect of the Bible. So in our first lesson on the Bible, we talked about how the Bible is both a human book and a divine book, all right? And what biblical criticism does is it focuses primarily on that human aspect, the human authors and the context of how they wrote and what they were thinking and that sort of thing, okay? So it doesn't, biblical criticism neither precludes nor necessarily includes the idea of divine authorship. So when we're employing the methods of biblical criticism, we may have in the back of our mind, we may have the awareness that this book is divinely inspired, or you may have somebody who doesn't believe the book is divinely inspired, and they are also employing these methods of biblical criticism, okay? So if you think about what we've said so far then, you realize that pretty much of what we've been doing for the last 3 weeks or so would fall into this category of biblical criticism. We've been focused a lot on the human dimensions of the Bible. Okay. Then there's biblical criticism is also used to address what we might think of as problem passages in the Bible. So passages in the Bible that might raise in our minds questions of credibility or trustworthiness or that sort of thing, okay? So, and we're all familiar with those. We always come across those. As we were driving back from Edmond yesterday from the birthday party, my wife raised a question about something from Stephen's defense in the book of Acts that seemed to be at odds with something that Genesis tells us about Abraham's father, okay? So we all encounter these kind of interesting passages in Scripture, what we might think of as problem passages. Some people might think of them as discrepancies or contradictions or that sort of thing. So one of the things that biblical criticism does is it addresses those. It tries to resolve those to some satisfaction in one way or another. But what we have to be aware of is that when any scholar approaches any subject, he does so with presuppositions. We've talked about this before. So a scientist approaching his science, or a historian approaching history, or just in any field of scholarly study, everybody always has their own kind of presuppositions they bring to the text, and those presuppositions may be just kind of assumed, they may be highly justified, or whatever. But given that, then the assumption, particularly like with postmodernists, is that since we all have our kind of presupposition, our own kind of outlook, you can't discover truth, and that's not true. Okay, it is possible, even though you have presuppositions, it's possible in coming to any field of study, but in case we're talking about in coming to the Bible, even though I have certain presuppositions, it's possible to still arrive at a sense of the truth, or an awareness of the truth, if I'm aware of my presuppositions and I take those into consideration as I explore the Scriptures and as I try to answer questions about the Bible. So we all have presuppositions. The question is, how do we handle those presuppositions in our search for truth? The problem is that many people who are engaged in biblical scholarship, many people engaged in biblical criticism, are operating from a strictly materialistic, anti-supernaturalist view. All right, so their view is the material world is all there is. God is not active in the world. So when they look at the Bible, when they read the Bible, when they study the Bible, when they're studying it from this, as we said, from the human dimension of the Bible, they typically just dismiss out of hand any possibility that God is acting in history or that miracles occur. So when they encounter reports of supernatural events in Scripture, they automatically assume that, at least on the face of them, they are not true. Now they may say they're true in some kind of metaphorical sense or something like that, but as far as being historically true, they dismiss that as just out of hand, just being impossible, because there either is no God or God is not active in the world. So if someone comes to the Bible with that presupposition, then that's going to color how they do this whole practice of biblical criticism. But John Warwick Montgomery is an old classic scholar, made this observation, and I think this is something we need to keep in mind, is that he says, historical and literary scholarship continues to follow Aristotle's dictum that the benefit of the doubt is to be given to the document itself and not arrogated to by the critic to himself. So as I come to the text, when I encounter difficulties in the text, what he says is the proper way, the way historically we've done literary criticism in general and historical criticism and biblical criticism, is the way it's been done since Aristotle, is we give the benefit of the doubt to the text. Okay? We don't just assume that we always know better. Okay? Now in some cases with some literary texts perhaps we do know better, but in general, unless I have good reason to believe otherwise, I should assume that the author of the text I'm writing knows what he's talking about, is being halfway intelligent, is being consistent. Oftentimes you'll have scholars who will try and point out contradictions, for example, between what Paul says in one place and what Paul says in another place. And of course what they're assuming there then is that Paul's not intelligent enough within his writings to be able to be consistent in his viewpoint. So the point that Montgomery's making from Aristotle is we give the benefit of the doubt to the author. We give the benefit of the doubt to the text unless we have some strong reason to do otherwise. All right? So oftentimes you'll hear discussion about something called higher criticism. And of course, higher criticism implies that there's something called lower criticism. So kind of in a very broad sense, you could divide the endeavor of biblical criticism into these kind of two broad categories. And lower criticism involves a lot of what we were doing last week. Okay, so it focuses on the words themselves and how the words are put together and how the words are preserved and that sort of thing. So there's lower criticism is focused on the text, the integrity of the text itself, how it was written, how it was copied, how it was preserved, and to what degree do our Bibles now represent what was originally written. That whole category of lower criticism covers that kind of focus on the text and the words. Okay. Then you get a higher criticism. And whereas lower criticism tends to be more objective, higher criticism tends to be a little bit more subjective, although not entirely so. Okay? And so you get this exercise of judgment in reference to the text, considering things like, well, just the nature of the text, the background sources, the background information that went into the compilation of the text, the oral traditions that were at play, and that sort of thing, the methods that are employed by the author as he writes, the subject, what subject is he dealing with, what are the arguments he makes, how does he make his arguments, how does he structure his arguments, the nature and the connection of the context So there we would be talking about the historical context, the cultural context, but also the textual context within the book as a whole, or the writing as a whole. How various passages might relate to one another, the circumstances under which the writer wrote, and the circumstances that the readers who were for the first readers of the document, or who were intended to be the first readers of the document, what were the circumstances that they were encountering. So for example, when you read some of the prophets in the Old Testament, one of the questions we ask ourselves, what were the children of Israel, or what were the people of Judah, what were they experiencing, what were they encountering at the time that this was written, why was it written in this way at this particular time, or what was a particular author experiencing at a time when he wrote something. So for example, as we approach the text of, say, the Pentateuch, say Genesis, which we know was written by Moses, and we'll discuss more of this next week about the timing of this and that sort of thing, but we know it was written by Moses in the wilderness to people who are in the wilderness. Obviously that's going to influence our understanding of Genesis, different than when we read the book of Colossians, which is written, more than a millennium later to an entirely different culture of people who are experiencing totally different experiences. So all of these things then are things that higher critics think about and talk about as they try to illuminate the text that they're studying. Okay? So, by definition then, higher criticism, there's no reason why higher criticism should be thought of as being inherently or intrinsically skeptical of the text and the authority and the credibility of the text. That's not, there's nothing in the idea of higher criticism that calls for the critic to be what we might say hypercritical of the Bible. Okay, but the reality is, excuse me, the reality is that many critics do use higher criticism in that way. So oftentimes when you hear conservative or evangelical preachers or teachers talking about biblical scholarship, they'll often talk about higher criticism in a very derogatory way. And the reason for that is oftentimes it's deserved. Oftentimes higher critics do engage in this kind of really radical skepticism regarding the Bible. And so it creates for us as Christians, and particularly as Christian apologists, it creates a situation for us where we need to be very discerning as we think about what scholars are saying about the Bible, and ask ourselves, are they being fair? Are they being honest? What are their presuppositions? Is this kind of just a radical skepticism that's going on here? Are they giving the text the benefit of the doubt? Things like that. So those are things we need to be thinking about. So today I want to look at several different ways or avenues of biblical criticism. So there's what's called classical, there's what's called textual, there's source criticism, form criticism, and redaction criticism. And I want to take, there are others besides this, but these are some of the big ones that you're likely to encounter. And I want to look at each one of those and look at the strengths and weaknesses of them. So classical criticism is basically what Christian scholars have been doing since the early church. Okay, so this is, if you pick up a commentary, whether you pick up a commentary of the Bible that was written in the 4th century, or you pick up a commentary of the Bible that was written in the 21st century, if it was written by a Christian author who is committed to the historic Christian faith, what you're going to encounter is classical criticism. Okay, so classical criticism attempts to understand the origin of the Bible, the nature of the Bible, again, at the human level. So if you open a commentary today, one of the first things you'll encounter is you start to, maybe you're going to read a commentary on Galatians. So you open the commentary, one of the first things you're going to encounter is a number of pages in which the commentator explores the human dimension of the text. Who wrote this text? When did they write it? Who did they write it to? What were the circumstances? That's all the human nature or the human aspect of the text. And so what classical criticism has done is it has looked at those kind of things that we've talked about, and also explores things like apparent discrepancies or problem text or that sort of thing. But classical criticism has done what Aristotle recommended we do, is it gives the benefit of the doubt to the text. So as you read Christian scholars down through the centuries, one of the things you'll see is that they always tend to give the benefit of the doubt to the text. So if there's something they don't understand, they will say, well, I don't understand this, but I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt to the author and to his intelligence and his integrity and that sort of thing. Okay? And I just listed a few practitioners, of classical criticism, and it would have been absurd to list them all because there are literally thousands of them. But my point in listing the ones I have listed is just to show how classical criticism has been practiced by Orthodox evangelical believers from the beginning of the church. So you have Eusebius and Augustine and Calvin and Lightfoot, and of course, as I said, thousands of others, and even many today still practicing what we would call classical criticism. And then there's what's called textual criticism, and this is what we spent a lot of our time talking about really last week. So textual criticism employs a more or less scientific, reasoned approach, kind of an empirical approach to discovering what was the original text. What did the author originally write? And of course this grows out of the problem we talked about last week, which was that we don't have any original copies. We don't have Paul's original letter to the Romans. We don't have, of course, Moses' first writing of the book of Deuteronomy. We don't have those things. So one of the things that textual criticism is doing is it's trying to discover what did the original writers write. Since we don't have a copy of that, we have copies of that and copies of copies. So how can we guarantee that the transmission was reliable? And that, of course, was the gist of what we talked about last week. And so it turns out that textual criticism is just remarkably effective. It's a really important tool and an effective tool in confirming that we have a reliable copy of what was originally written. And this is actually a slide from last week, but a textual critic will look at just a number of different things, and I've listed several of them there for you. They'll look at what the manuscript is actually written on. They'll study the dating of the manuscript, and they can do that by looking at the ink, by looking at the material that it's written on. They can tell sometimes by the style of writing. There's many different things that they use to date a manuscript. They'll look again, like I said, they'll look at the style of the hand, the particular style that an author wrote. Did he use what we call documentary hand or book hand, like we talked about last week? As well as they'll even look at the individual style handwriting of various scribes, and they can identify when a particular scribe wrote two different manuscripts because they can tell by their handwriting, even as we can today. Of course, they look at the content, what the manuscript is about. They look at what family of manuscripts a particular manuscript falls into. We talked about that last week. They talked about how they look at how one manuscript compares to other manuscripts of the same text. So these are all various tools that textual critics have to be able to look at and study and figure out what was the original, what did the original autograph say. And given that we have so many thousands of manuscripts, particularly I'm speaking here of the New Testament, but again, as we saw last week, we do of the Old Testament as well. Since we have so many thousands of manuscripts, textual criticism is able to be just remarkably successful in giving us confidence that we can know what was in the original text. So textual criticism is what we talked about last week, and it falls into that category of what we call lower criticism. Okay. Then there's something called source criticism. Okay. And what source criticism does is it tends to form conclusions about a text, about a Bible book or whatever, based on, in part, what were the written sources that lie behind what the biblical author wrote. So the idea there is that the biblical authors used other written sources in order to gather their information and then write what they wrote. And so some of the questions that source criticism will ask is, what was the source? What was the source behind what Matthew wrote? What was the source, behind what Paul wrote in a certain place, or what John wrote in a certain place? And then the other question is not only what was the source, but what did that source say? All right? And then the third question is, how did the biblical author, if he had these other sources that he used, and if we happen to know what those other sources said, then we look at what the biblical author did, we can see how he used that source. What did he take from that source that he used? What did he not use from that source? What did he decide not to use from that source? Now this, of course, raises all kinds of questions. And one of the questions would be, if the Bible is inspired, then how can I believe that the authors of the Bible use sources from things that were not necessarily inspired? But we do know that the biblical writers used sources, okay? With virtual certainty we know they did, and one reason is because they tell us they did, okay? So there are a number of places in the Bible where the author of a particular text tells us about sources he used or sources he referred to. So, for example, Luke tells us in Luke chapter 1, he tells the person he's writing to, he tells him that he had access to many other written accounts. Okay? And he said he also had access to eyewitnesses. So these were people to whom Luke had access, as he sought, he said, to put everything down in consecutive order. All right? Now, when you think about that, he says he had many written sources. Now, Luke wrote, virtually all scholars agree, Luke wrote before John. So the Gospel of John wasn't available. Presumably, and most scholars believe, that Mark and Matthew were one of the sources that Luke used, okay? So that would be two sources, but Luke doesn't tell us he had two sources. Luke tells us he had many written sources, right? So there were apparently many sources available that are not included in our canon. That for one reason or another, the church didn't preserve, the Holy Spirit didn't see it fit to preserve those texts. We don't have them. They're not included in the canon. We don't necessarily consider them to be authoritative. We don't consider them to be inspired. But Luke used them in compiling the inspired text that he did write, right? And there are other examples. So Moses in Numbers talks about something called the Wars of Jehovah, okay? He talks about it. We have no idea what it was. We have no copy of it or anything like that, okay? Chronicles, in 1 Chronicles, the writer of Chronicles talks about several other sources he used. He talks about the Chronicles of Samuel the seer. That may be, in fact, 1 and 2 Samuel. We don't know for sure. He talks about the Chronicles of Nathan the prophet. What is he talking about there? We don't know for sure. He talks about the Chronicles of Gad the seer. These are all sources that the writer of 1 Chronicles used. The writer of 2 Chronicles, whether it was the same guy or not, we don't know for sure. He talks about the prophecy of Ahijah, and he talks about the visions of Iddo the seer. So over and over again we see examples of biblical writers referring to sources that they used as they compiled the text that they wrote. And then we have, in addition to explicit statements of dependence on sources, we have obvious literary dependence, okay? So, for example, if you read 2 Peter and you read Jude, one of the things that jumps out to you is in many places those two little short books are identical, okay? And so it's just really striking how identical that they're actually word for word the same in many places. And so it seems like one or the other depended on the other, okay? There's just some literary dependence apparently going on there. Paul, we see in a number of places, he cites a creed or he quotes a early Christian hymn or whatever. It's very clear he's using some kind of sources. And then when you read the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you see a great deal of similarity between them. They seem to be dependent. Either Matthew's dependent on Mark or Mark's dependent on Matthew, and scholars differ as to which is which. Luke seems to be also dependent on Mark and perhaps Matthew some. But just there's so much similarity that it seems that they are depending on one another. But what we have to keep in mind, you know, when I first, you know, as I was a Christian, when I was a young kid just growing up and learning that the Bible was inspired, I just thought, you know, the Bible writers they sat down to write and the Holy Spirit just told them everything to write and they just wrote it and that was it, you know. And when someone first introduced to me the idea that there were sources that weren't inspired and that weren't authoritative that the Bible writers used, then I go, well, then how can the Bible be inspired? Okay, but clearly the existence of sources doesn't preclude the operation of the Holy Spirit in the writing of the sacred text. So if Moses is sitting down and he's writing out his account of things in the Pentateuch for the children of Israel there in Egypt, and if he refers to the wars of Jehovah, whatever they were, if he refers to the wars of Jehovah, even though the wars of Jehovah are not inspired, if the Holy Spirit inspires Moses to include those, then they become part of the inspired text. So a classic example of that would, of course, be Paul in Titus chapter 1, where Paul quotes a pagan Cretan poet. Right? And he quotes him, clearly not inspired, clearly not authoritative, but when Paul quotes him and then says, this testimony is true, then we have inspired text and inspired assessment of the Cretans, right? So just the existence of sources is not problematic. And so one of the things that source criticism does is it looks at these kind of things. So if we can have with some degree of confidence some knowledge of what a source said, okay, that a biblical writer used, then that might shed some illumination on what the biblical author wrote. So for example, if I'm reading in the New Testament and one of the New Testament writers uses as his source something from the book of Isaiah, I've got the book of Isaiah. I can go back and I can read what Isaiah said, and that might help shed light then on what the New Testament writer is talking about when he uses that source, all right? The problem is, however, arises when I don't know what the source was, or I don't know what was in the source, what the content of the source was, and I don't even know for sure if there was a source. So that's where we run into the problem of what we might call radical skepticism. So source criticism is oftentimes used by radical skeptics, all right, to as they approach the Bible with this kind of anti-supernaturalist, materialist perspective or worldview, what they want to do is they want to separate the miraculous and the supernatural from the text and just leave the text without all the supernatural junk in it, all right? So one of the things they do is they employ source criticism to do that. And the problem is that source criticism has significant limits to it, all right? So one of the things is, other than when a biblical writer is citing other biblical writers, other than that, we don't have any sources that the biblical writers use. We don't have a copy of, we don't have manuscript evidence of any sources outside of the Bible that a biblical writer may have used. So, for example, we don't have the source that Paul was looking at or thinking about when he said what he did to Titus, when he wrote what he did to Titus. He said one of their own prophets says this, but we don't have that source, so we can't go back and double check it, right? So we don't know what the source was. So the problem is then that in many cases we don't even know if there was a source. So oftentimes what you'll get with the radical skeptics is they'll say, well, the biblical author was using a source here, but he has no evidence of that. He doesn't even have evidence of that in the biblical text. He doesn't have the biblical author is not saying he's using a source. So the radical skeptic is just kind of assuming that he used a source there. All right? But since we don't actually, outside of the Bible itself, we don't possess any of the sources, all right? We have no way of knowing what the sources said. So if a radical scholar is wanting to construct an argument about what a biblical writer is saying based on what his source said, if he doesn't have the source, if he doesn't know what the source says, if he can't prove what the source says, then he's really kind of just into just wild speculation at that point, okay? So for us to really be able to illuminate the biblical text from the source and from what the source says, we need to know what the source was and we need to know what the source said. And for a great deal of source criticism, that just can't be done. And that takes us the next step into what's called form criticism. And form criticism is like source criticism, except source criticism deals with the literary source, the written source behind a text. Form criticism deals with the oral source or the oral tradition behind a text. Okay? So it forges conclusions about a text based on what oral traditions or forms, and that's where the word form criticism comes from, on what oral traditions the critic believes the author may have employed in writing his work. Okay? So here again, the form critic is assuming or believing for one reason or another that a biblical author is using some oral tradition to write down what he wrote or to say what he says. Okay? And this particular approach to biblical criticism was pioneered by a liberal German scholar by the name of Rudolf Bultmann back in the 1920s. And there are several defining characteristics of form criticism which make it very problematic. One is it assumes that the Gospels are what are called folk literature. Okay? What is folk literature? Well, folk literature is you have a long period, oftentimes many decades or generations or maybe even centuries of the oral transmission of stories or traditions down through time, and then at some point somebody writes those down. Okay? And at the point at which they write them down, then they become literature, but it's literature based upon the folk stories that have been passed down from generation to generation to generation. So what form criticism does is it assumes that the Gospels are folk literature. Okay? So the idea then is that prior to their being written down, these various stories that we encounter in the Gospels of Jesus walking on water or the resurrection or various stories in the Gospels, that before they were written down, they were passed down as folklore for many, 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 many years. All right? And that what the church was really interested in doing as it passed these stories down and then progressively embellished them. So we start out with this kind of very remote character, Jesus, and next week we're going to talk about the so-called quest for the historical Jesus. But there's this kind of remote, kind of unknown rabbi in the past, and the followers of Jesus then began to tell these folk stories, okay, or this folklore about Jesus, and they began to add all these stories, and Jesus became kind of a greater and greater figure, and eventually he began, in the folklore, he began to claim to be divine or to be the Messiah and that sort of thing, okay? And so the point is that the church was more concerned about building its religious faith than it was about history. Okay, so the idea is that folklore is really more about the story than it is about the history. Right? A third feature of form criticism is that the idea is that these stories were transmitted by the folk. They were transmitted by the community rather than coming back to being traced back to a single individual. So it's not that there were any eyewitnesses, there's not that there were any particular individuals who actually saw this. These stories were just kind of passed on by the community. So the emphasis is not on the eyewitnesses or the real origin of the story in real history, but rather in this whole idea of the community just creating these stories and passing them down. So what it's trying to discover is what it calls the tradition history. So what form criticism is trying to do is it doesn't really want to know if these stories are true or not. It just wants to understand how these stories were conveyed and developed and passed down from generation to generation. Now, it turns out that form criticism has been really profoundly influential in how people view the Bible. And this is one of the reasons we need to be familiar with it. So you may have heard of the Jesus Seminar. We'll talk about it next week. I just referred to something from the 19th century called the Quest for the Historical Jesus. We'll talk about that next week. All of these ideas and movements had a profound impact on how contemporary people that you rub shoulders with today view the Bible, and particularly view the Gospels and the stories about Jesus. So these ideas that are generated out of radical source criticism and form criticism really affect how people view, for example, the Gospels, and how they affect particularly the Pentateuch. And when you think about it, of all the Bible, of course, all the Bible is important, but the really foundational books that our faith is built upon are the first 5 books of the Old Testament and the first 4 books of the New Testament, right? So it's the Pentateuch and the Gospels that really are the foundation of the Christian faith, and that's where a great deal of the attack lies, okay? So it's something we just need to be equipped to handle. So what are some of the flaws that really are fatal to this whole practice of form criticism? And one is it's using, as it says here, it's using a model of transmission that applies to a process over many generations, and it applies it to a situation that covered no more than one lifetime. So, in other words, what form criticism is doing is it's saying, okay, as these stories get passed on orally from one person to another, and one decade to another, and then one generation to another, as they get passed on, this process of corruption tends to take place. Okay, so that's an assumption it's making, and it's applying that model of corruption of a story over a period of many decades or generations, and it's applying it to something we know, to literature that we know was written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. Okay, so it's a misapplication of a misunderstanding of how oral transmission works. Secondly, it totally ignores the institution of the apostles. Okay, so the apostles were designated by Jesus to be the conveyors of his message to the church and to the world, right? And so they served first as the conveyors of the message, and then they served as the safeguards of the message. Form criticism completely ignores the role of the apostles in safeguarding the message and making sure that when the message was written down, that it accurately represented Jesus and what he taught. And then it also ignores not only the role of the apostles themselves as safeguards, but it ignores the fact that the apostles didn't call on people just to trust them. The apostles referred to the eyewitnesses, right? So when Peter is preaching at Pentecost, he's preaching there in Jerusalem, he's saying, look, these things happened here just a few weeks ago. You people saw them, right? So he's referring to eyewitnesses. Paul, of course, in 1 Corinthians 15 on the resurrection, when he's talking about the resurrection, he doesn't just say, trust me because I'm an apostle. He says, listen, there were 500 eyewitnesses out there. Most of them are still alive. Go talk to them, okay? So what form criticism does is it ignores both the role of the apostles and the role of eyewitnesses. And then this goes back to things we talked about last week about oral societies and how oral societies work, all right? So it really has a misunderstanding of oral societies and oral transmission. So for one thing, it fails to distinguish between what are oral traditions and oral history. So again, these are things we talked about last week, that within oral cultures, they tend to make a distinction between their traditions and their histories. And oral cultures tend to be less precise in how they communicate just their fun stories or whatever, right? Just their stories that are interesting or whatever. And the things that they regard as their history, which they insist are preserved and passed down in a very precise way. So this is a characteristic of oral cultures, and we see that in the early church, that even in those first 10, 15, 20 years before things really were written down in a form that we still have today, to the degree that there was an oral transmission there, we can assume that they were employing these techniques that oral cultures used to preserve their histories, okay? So oral histories in contrast to oral traditions were safeguarded by these various mechanisms that we talked about last week. So form criticism is deeply problematic. And then we have something called redaction criticism. And of course the word redact just simply means to edit for publication, right? So probably where we're most familiar with the term is when somebody's going to release a government document, right? And that government document may have some classified information, but it needs to be released to the public for some reason. And so they will redact the document, right? They'll take a black magic marker or whatever and they'll blacken out the classified information so that the other information can be publicly disseminated, okay? So the idea of redaction is simply the idea of editing, of deciding what am I going to disseminate as information and what am I going to withhold, what am I not going to say. And the fact is that all authors use redaction. If you've ever written anything, you have used redaction, right? Unless it was a little one-sentence note to your husband to pick up bread or something. If you've written anything of a page or longer, you have employed redaction, right? You make decisions about what you're going to write and what you're not going to bother writing, right? So you make decisions about what things you're going to include. You make decisions about what things you're going to exclude, okay? And you do this for several reasons. One is you have limited space and time. And this is particularly true in ancient times because writing books was very expensive, and parchment and materials on which to write were very expensive, and scribes were very expensive to hire. So you wanted to make sure that you said what was important to say and you didn't say anything else, right? So just the limits of space and time. Another reason an author, either ancient or contemporary uses redaction is they have a theme. They have some point they want to make, okay? And so if there are some things that may be true and they may be relevant, but they really don't serve the purpose of forwarding the theme or the point that the person wants to make, then you leave that out, right? When I was going through Roundtable, the 3 years of Roundtable, the first year you'd have to write a paper you could present in 5 minutes, and the second year you'd have to write papers you could present in 10 minutes, and then the third year you wrote papers you had to be able to present in 15 minutes. Well, you probably know enough about me about this time that I tend to be fairly verbose. So I would sit down and write my paper, you know, and then I'd spend the next 2 weeks deciding what I was going to cut out of my paper to get it down to the time that I had to make the presentation. So I cut out everything that was extraneous to my point so that I could get it communicated in the time that I had. Unfortunately, sometimes redaction is used to distort people's perception of reality, right? So we choose to leave out things that maybe they really should know, but for one reason or another we don't want them to know, and so we leave them. So authors use redaction for any number of reasons. Now, what redaction criticism does is it seeks to understand why the author included what he did include and why he didn't include other things we know he could have included, right? So, for example, if I see Luke telling a story about something that happened in the life of Jesus, and then I read Matthew and I see Matthew include some things that Luke didn't include, or I see Matthew include some things that Luke didn't include, I might ask my question, why? And maybe by just noticing what he chooses to exclude, I can get some sense of, well, what's his theme? What is the theme he's trying to develop that he's chosen to leave this out and maybe include something else, okay? And this approach to studying the Bible has been a common practice by Christian scholars from the very beginning, okay? So Christian scholars from the very beginning have asked questions about, well, why is this in a particular text and this is not in a particular text, okay? You've done it yourself. You've read the Bible and you've gone, I want to know this, but he doesn't tell me this. Why didn't he tell me this? This is what I want to know, you know? And so just reflecting on those things helps us to gain illumination of the text. But more recently, in the last couple hundred years or so, this whole idea of redaction criticism has been employed by the materialists, the naturalists, the anti-supernaturalists, in order to undermine our confidence in the Scripture. Okay? So we just need to be aware of that. And so what we call radical redaction criticism, that form of redaction criticism which really is calling into radical question the credibility of Scripture, what we need to realize is that a great deal of this is presuming certain things, all right? So in one way it's assuming that all the stories of the supernatural or all the stories of God's intervention in history aren't historical, okay? And so in trying to understand how the text was compiled, the radical redaction critic seeks to understand, well, why did he include these stories if they didn't actually happen, okay? So they seek to exclude everything that's supernatural. The other thing, and this is, when you hear it, you'll go, that's bizarre, okay? But one of the things that radical redaction criticism assumes is that if knowing what we know about the early church from external writings, okay, from maybe the writings of the church fathers or from things outside of the Bible, knowing what we know about the early church, if we're reading in the Gospels and we encounter something in the Gospels that coincides with what we know the early church believed from our outside sources, from our other sources, then that's not historical. Yeah, it's just a flip of what you would expect, right? So if any teaching expressed in the Gospels corresponds to one in the early church, it must of necessity be inauthentic. The logic is, remember, all this information, all this stuff was folk literature. It was passed down through many generations. So if I have something that I know the early church believed from early writings, other early writings, and I know they believe this, and I find it in the gospel, the church must have added it through their folk literature. Okay? So and there are actually critics who do this, and they look, and if they see a correspondence between the gospels and the early church, instead of concluding, oh, well, this is why the early church believed it, because it was in their early literature, instead of concluding that, they conclude, oh, this was added by the church later, and so they discount it as being historical. Okay? So there are some fundamental problems with this kind of redaction criticism. Okay? And first of all, again, it just fails to recognize the role of eyewitnesses. So again, the whole eyewitness nature of the Gospels is discounted. Plus, it employs some of the faulty presuppositions that lie in form criticism. So all the problems we saw with form criticism get swallowed up into this kind of radical reduction criticism. Secondly, it's just full of speculation about the background sources. So this goes back to source criticism and form criticism. To the degree that the form critic or the source critic is speculating about what those earlier sources or forms were that lie behind the written biblical text, to the degree that they're speculating about that, everything that they then speculate using redaction criticism is based on those faulty presuppositions. And then the next problem with redaction criticism is oftentimes it improperly employs what are called the criteria of authenticity. So what are the criteria of authenticity? And we'll talk a little bit more about this next week. But with any historical text, when a scholar is studying a historical text, he may just be reading it and studying it and just assuming that it's true, and he doesn't have any reason to believe it's not true. But he may come across certain things in the text that make him go, oh, well, yeah, that really shows it's true. Okay, so in other words, there are various characteristics that you may come across in a text that enhance your confidence in its truthfulness. All right? So there are certain aspects within any historical text, and certainly within the New Testament, that increase our confidence. We may have confidence in its authenticity or its veracity, but actually increase that, enhance that, and develop that. And so in the New Testament, there are several of those, but one would be multiple attestations. So if you have, for example, two different sources. Now again, Matthew, Mark, and Luke used each other some, but there are some cases where Luke seems to be using a different source than Matthew. And if he's using a different source than Matthew, and they both are saying the same thing, you have two witnesses, okay? Or if you have Paul in 1 Corinthians about the resurrection saying things that Matthew says about the resurrection or Mark says about the resurrection, you have two different sources. Or you may have an outside source, a source external to the Bible. When you have multiple attestation about something in the Gospels, that increases your confidence in its truthfulness, right? Embarrassing material, right? So when the writers of the Gospels, wanting to communicate this whole concept of the church and the idea of the church and the community of believers, when they write things about the disciples quarreling or Peter denying the Lord, okay, these are things that really work counterproductive to what they're trying to accomplish, which is building confidence in, for example, the leadership of the church, right? So it's embarrassing material that it seems unlikely somebody would just have made up. So it increases our confidence when we encounter embarrassing material. The fact that the women are the primary witnesses to the resurrection. It's really fascinating that in the Gospels there's a great deal of emphasis on the women as the primary witnesses to the resurrection, right? And here's a little bit of redaction criticism going on. When you get to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 and he lists all the witnesses to the resurrection, he doesn't mention a single woman. He only mentions men. Okay? So there's an interesting thing going on there in that in one sense this thing about the women is kind of embarrassing given the cultural context, right? So why did all the Gospels make such a big thing out of it? It seems like they would have emphasized the role of the men, which clearly Paul does in 1 Corinthians 15. And then if you want to do a little redaction criticism, why doesn't Paul mention the women? Okay, that'd be something to explore and study, and there are actually some good answers to that, but we won't go into those now. The other thing to realize about the criteria of authenticity is they can only be used in a positive sense. In other words, they can only be used to enhance the credibility of our confidence in the credibility of the text. If the criteria are not there, you can't say the text is inauthentic. And this is where radical higher criticism fault breaks down, is it concludes that if it looks at a New Testament text or a gospel text and it doesn't see one of these criteria of authenticity, it goes, well, then it's not authentic. But you can't conclude that. You don't have to have a criteria of authenticity. You don't have to have one to have confidence the text is true. It's just that when you do have them, they do aid in boosting your confidence in the text. So it's possible for a text to be historically accurate and not possess any of the criteria. So we say that the criteria are sufficient to enhance the credibility of a text, but they are not necessary to have confidence in the text. Okay? So next week then we're going to go on and we're going to actually look at some ways these various approaches to biblical criticisms have been employed to try to undermine the scriptures. So we're going to look at something called the documentary hypothesis. This has to do with the Pentateuch. We're going to look at the actual several quests for the historical Jesus and things like that. We're going to look at the question of the Bible as myth and that sort of thing. So that's where we're headed next week. Okay? Any comments or questions? Got it all down.